My wife asked to go to a romantic dinner with a strange man, but my cruel response left her pale. I simply handed her her bags and said, "You can go, but don't come back." I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply ended everything that had once been ours. She went, thinking she would experience something better. But the strange man wanted nothing more than one night, and soon disappeared. Alone, she discovered the weight of her own choices. I moved on, in my own time, and found a new love, one who offers me peace, respect, and a caring that requires no proof. Months later, she tried to reach out to me. I looked at her with compassion and said, "I've forgiven you, but that chapter is behind us." She was left with the absence, I with the freedom to start over. I never imagined that that night, which began with a simple request from her, would end as the final point in the story we both swore to write together. It was all so calm, and perhaps that's why it hurt so much. The deepest pain isn't the one that comes with screaming, but the one that comes with silence. She looked at me with practiced coldness, almost expecting me to beg, to lose control, to cry. But I just told her she could go. There was no longer any point in trying to hold on to someone who had long been in another life, even though they lived in the same house. I saw, in the reflection of the hallway mirror, the exact moment she realized there was no going back. And yet, she went. It's strange how betrayal doesn't begin in a hotel bed. It begins before. It begins in the small distance between our eyes, in the absence of simple questions, in the touch that becomes an obligation, in the kiss that tastes bland. It begins in the "I'll be right back" that never returns the same. I realized I was losing her long before that dinner. But like every man in love, I refused to accept it. I thought it was just a phase. That time would mend. That love would win. Love, oh, that fool who clings to crumbs thinking there's still a feast. And maybe I really was that fool for too long. I believed love was enough. That the memories, the plans, the effort, would be enough. But they weren't. The night she left, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry either. I stood in the hallway for hours, staring at the emptiness where suitcases, coats, and perfumes had once been scattered. I sat on the couch where we'd watched movies, now just the white noise of the TV. The silence in the house was deafening. And even there, amid such a tangible absence, I felt only one thing, relief. Yes, love hadn't died, but it had grown tired of crying out for help on its own. And that was the relief, knowing that now the wound could finally begin to heal. Even if it hurt. She went to experience what she thought was love. The mysterious man who seemed more interesting than routine, more exciting than Sundays in pajamas, more attractive than the struggle of maintaining a home. And he, like so many who appear promising the world, disappeared before breakfast. One night was enough. A single night. And what she had thrown away in years, he discarded in hours. She bet everything on a dream and woke up in a nightmare of silence. The difference between fantasy and real love presented itself to her in the cruelest way. True love doesn't seduce, it sustains. It doesn't shine all the time, but it never fades. The other, the stranger, was only a reflection of a temporary desire, and she fell head over heels. The days that followed were strangely calm. There were no more messages, no calls, no apologies. She wanted to hide her shame, and I let her. I mourned in silence. I looked at photographs, listened to the songs she loved, mentally replayed the conversations where I tried to save her from the abyss and she'd chosen to jump. But I didn't blame myself. For the first time in months, maybe years, I knew I'd done everything I could. The love I offered wasn't insignificant. It was whole, constant, and loyal. And if it wasn't enough, the fault wasn't mine. A few weeks later, she showed up. She expected to find a broken man. But she saw me standing. She saw me at peace. She saw me with calm eyes and a firm posture. She tried to smile, perhaps hoping for a sign of hidden affection. But all I had was respect. Respect for the history we had, but no longer love for what she had destroyed. She realized, in that instant, what she had lost. It wasn't a man. It was a home. It was a comfortable silence, a presence that demanded nothing but truth. And she had traded all that for a moment of illusion. I clearly remember the day she saw me walking with another woman. I didn't see her right away, but I felt her gaze. And in that gaze, there was a pain I knew. A mixture of regret and absence. She hid behind a lamppost, as if observing a ghost from the past. But it wasn't a ghost. It was me. Alive. And finally, happy. The smile she knew was back, but it wasn't hers anymore. The laugh, the sparkle in her eyes, the touch of her hands, everything was the same as she once had, but now belonged to someone else. And that, in itself, was the cruelest punishment. Not because of the pain, but because of the silent realization that certain things, once lost, never have the same taste again. One day she wrote to me. A simple request for forgiveness. An attempt to say she missed me. But I no longer missed her. I'd missed myself for a long time. And now that I'd found myself again, I didn't intend to give up the peace I'd built. I forgave, yes. Not for her, but for myself. Because carrying hatred is remaining trapped. And I was already free. The pain of betrayal isn't just the broken trust. It's the lost time. The nights you were there while the other person was gone. It's the hugs you gave out of habit, the kisses that tasted like the end. It's looking at someone and knowing their soul no longer resides there. But it's also in the strength that emerges afterward. In the rebuilding that comes when the pain subsides. In the love that emerges when you stop begging for scraps. Today, I look back and see clearly, I didn't lose a wife. I lost someone who was no longer with me. But I regained the man I was before I tried to save someone who didn't want to be saved. And I gained someone new, someone who truly loves me. Who chooses me every day, without needing me to prove my worth with every gesture. Someone who wouldn't trade what we have for an empty promise. She, in turn, was left with the memories. With the saved photos. With the what-ifs that will never be answered. With the longing for something she destroyed with her own hands. And I was left with the freedom to start over. But what she never knew, and perhaps never will, is what I did that very night, after she left. What I found, where I was, and what finally freed me from that story. The answer to that, is something no one has yet discovered. Welcome to the channel. Here, none what form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. All stories are fictional, but inspired by real life, and carry a painful truth: cheating destroys, hurts, and takes a heavy toll. Our goal is to show, unfiltered, the real consequences of bad choices. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a warning. Take a deep breath. A shocking drama about love, loss, and regret is coming. His name was Daniel, and for a long time he believed that love was, above all, a safe place. He was the kind of man who didn't promise the world, but delivered what mattered most: presence, respect, and constancy. At 34, he worked as a data analyst at a technology company, led an organized life, without excess, and wore a discreet smile, the kind that doesn't try to impress anyone, but exudes tranquility. He was reserved, but observant. He listened more than he spoke. He was practical, but had a romantic side few knew, and which, when it emerged, surprised even him. He believed that love was proven in everyday life, not in performances. He loved silently, but deeply. That was the kind of love I had to offer. Her name was Emily, and she seemed to have emerged from somewhere where beauty was delicately crafted. She had a light sparkle in her eyes, an easy laugh, and an energy that, upon entering a room, didn't go unnoticed. She worked as an interior designer and was passionate about everything involving aesthetics, organization, and sensations. She had artistic sensitivity and a naturally engaging manner. She knew how to listen, but spoke passionately about everything she loved. She was intense, but carried a quiet, almost imperceptible insecurity. She had a huge heart, but demanded to be remembered. She needed affection, not just in the feelings, but in the demonstration of it. She valued the everyday, but also craved a touch of novelty, a respite from the routine. And it was in this middle ground between tranquility and desire that she and Daniel met. The beginning of their relationship was marked by an unremarkable encounter, a rainy afternoon, a chance coffee, and a conversation that stretched on longer than time allowed. They didn't know at the time that that coffee would change everything. There were no impactful phrases or immediate promises. But there was a strange peace between them, as if the world had lowered its volume just so they could hear each other better. The connection was subtle but firm. It didn't start like a bolt of lightning, but like a candle lit in a dark room. Gradually, the light took over. And they allowed it to grow. For the first few months, their relationship seemed perfectly balanced. Daniel was stable, calm, and patient. Emily was sensitive, creative, and spontaneous. He was captivated by the way she saw beauty in everything, from an antique china cup to the colors of a sunset reflected in a random window. She felt secure in his constancy, in his simple, surefire gestures, like picking up her car for her on rainy days or making coffee before she woke up. They completed each other. Or at least, they thought they did. And perhaps they did, for a time. They built a life together without any major overstatements, but with small touches. They rented a spacious apartment in a quiet area, with a balcony where she planted herbs and flowers, and he spent his evenings reading quietly with a cup of tea beside him. They decorated the space with touches of both, his minimalism and her delicate details. Their routines fell into place effortlessly. They shared chores, cooked together, went on weekend trips, and created small but meaningful rituals. Every Friday, for example, was wine and a randomly selected movie night. Every Sunday morning, she made pancakes while he prepared the week's playlist. There, in that space, was something many would call emotional stability. And for a long time, that was exactly what it was. But, like almost everything in life, stability begins to generate silences that, when misunderstood, can become walls. And it was at this point that, without realizing it, they began to drift apart without moving from one place to another. There were no fights. There were no heated arguments. There was just a small distance that grew through everyday gestures. He, immersed in work and the quest to maintain the structure they'd built, she, increasingly missing a more vibrant connection, a kind of attention that wasn't merely functional. He thought he was loving by taking care of everything responsibly. She felt she was being forgotten in the details. Daniel noticed some changes in her. Emily was quieter, more reflective. She spent more time on her phone, sometimes smiling to herself, but when he asked, she responded with a nothing, which wasn't true, but also wasn't easy to question. He respected her space, always had. He was never controlling, never wanted to invade anything that wasn't offered. But inside him, a silent discomfort began to grow. He tried to compensate with more dedication, more organization, more stability. He believed that by maintaining a strong foundation, everything would hold together. Little did he know that what she wanted most at that moment was to be heard with her heart, not just with practical care. Emily, on the other hand, found herself racked with an internal conflict she could barely understand. She loved Daniel, there was no doubt about that. But she missed something she couldn't quite name. It was as if, with him, she had everything anyone needed to be happy, yet still, something in her heart craved more. More she couldn't explain, and it made her feel ungrateful, guilty, confused. She tried to hide it, tried to convince herself it was just a phase. But the questions grew within her, is this all there is? Is this really how love should be maintained? What if I'm slowly fading away? What if he doesn't even notice? The house remained organized. Pancakes were still made on Sundays. But something had changed, albeit subtly. The music at breakfast now played at a lower volume. Dinner conversations were quicker. The bedtime touch was automatic, not a gesture filled with intention. Daniel, even without fully understanding, felt he had lost something, but he still couldn't pinpoint what it was. He tried to reconnect with her, suggesting trips, making simple surprises, but there was a distance in her eyes that hurt, like a silent scream. And she, even as she pulled away, hoped he would pull her back. But neither of them knew how to do that without seeming desperate. And the silence became habitual. Over time, other elements began to take the place of what had once been a close bond. New friends, new environments, more time apart. Emily started going out more often. She spent the night at events, meetings, and coffees with colleagues he didn't know. Daniel tried not to show discomfort, he was always understanding. But each new name she mentioned felt like a reminder that he was, little by little, being replaced, not by someone else, but by a version of life he no longer fit into. And yet, he didn't react. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of pride. Or maybe because, deep down, I still believed everything would fall into place, as it always had. Meanwhile, she tried to convince herself that she needed space, air, something that would make her feel alive again. She didn't yet know if that something was a new project, a new social circle, or simply finding herself outside the role of ideal wife. The fact is, Emily was torn between loyalty to everything they'd experienced together and the restlessness that had taken hold of her lately. Daniel, for his part, continued trying to maintain what they'd built. He believed that true love also went through silent phases, and that survival was part of the process. He didn't yet know that the calm he so prized would be precisely what she would interpret as disinterest. They remained together. Living under the same roof, sharing meals, splitting bills, commitments, and weekends. But the truth is, they were no longer in the same time period. While he looked to the future with hope, she looked to the present with anxiety. While he believed love was in the little things, she felt she was disappearing into them. And it was in this gap of unspoken feelings that distance finally set in, silent, comfortable, and dangerous. What neither of them knew yet was that the breaking point had already begun to form. A choice was about to be made. One seemingly small action would have the power to change everything. And when that moment arrived, nothing they had experienced up until that point would be enough to prevent their fall. The question remains, what happens when love doesn't die, but simply no longer finds a place to exist? Daniel began to notice the signs more clearly when Sundays became too quiet. Emily, once so involved in the little traditions they'd created together, now distracted herself with her phone while the smell of pancakes still wafted through the kitchen. Her eyes seemed distant, as if her mind was always elsewhere. He tried not to take it personally, but deep down, he sensed something was changing, more seriously than he cared to admit. For weeks, he ignored the feeling that he was losing ground in her life. Perhaps out of fear of facing the truth, or perhaps because he still held out hope that everything would return to normal. Hope is what keeps many men enduring the unbearable, and Daniel was no different. Communication between them had become matter of fact. It was just short phrases, questions about schedules, bills, grocery lists. Moments of emotional connection were becoming scarce like water in a drought. Emily, for her part, was sinking deeper and deeper into a silent search for something she might not even know how to name. She started going out more at night, always with excuses that seemed too reasonable to question. Work events, networking dinners, meetings with colleagues from side projects. Daniel trusted her, always had. But she also began to notice a change in her looks, her touches, or rather, the lack thereof. She missed things that used to be natural, the lingering kiss upon arriving home, the spontaneous hug in the middle of the day, the laughter that sprang up for no reason. One night, when he arrived home early from work, he found her sitting on the couch, laughing to herself while typing on her phone. She was startled to see him, quickly closing the screen, and forcing a smile that he realized was fake. He didn't ask anything. He simply left his keys on the counter and went to shower. The trust that had always been solid as concrete began to show invisible cracks. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The new clothes, the makeup she didn't usually wear during the week, the frequency with which she changed her perfume. But even with all these clues, Daniel refused to suspect anything more serious. He preferred to believe it was just a phase of rediscovery, that she was searching for herself, and that, somehow, this still included them. But there were nights when she no longer slept at home. She said they were events that ended too late to return. That it was more practical to sleep at a friend's house. And he, even with a heavy heart, accepted without question. He kept his discomfort, his jealousy, his anguish to himself. Because he never wanted to be the kind of man who suffocated. He never wanted to be the controlling one. And because, deep down, he still wanted to believe that Emily was, above all, loyal. But the distance grew. And she, even physically present, was increasingly absent. She spent hours on phone calls that she abruptly ended when he entered the room. She looked away when he tried to talk about their relationship. She refused affection with empty excuses. The connection that was once solid was now made of fragile, poorly woven threads. Until one day, Emily asked to talk. They were in the living room, the evening light streaming through the windows, giving the scene a look too peaceful for what was to come. She sat with trembling hands, her eyes avoiding his, and said she needed to be honest. She said she had met someone. She couldn't explain how or when, but she felt she needed to experience it. That it wasn't about a lack of love, but about the need to reconnect with herself. That she didn't want to lie anymore, or pretend to a normalcy that no longer existed. And finally, she said that this man, someone he didn't even know by name, had invited her to dinner. A romantic dinner. And that she wanted to go. That she needed to go. And that she hoped he would understand. Daniel said nothing. He didn't scream or cry. He just got up, walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, and began calmly taking out her clothes. He folded each item with a calmness that, at any other time, could have been interpreted as coldness. He put everything into 2 suitcases. He set aside the shoes, the perfumes, the souvenirs. There was no anger in his eyes, only a suppressed, deep, but silent pain. He returned to the living room, placed the suitcases beside the door, and, in a firm voice, said simply, "You can go, but don't come back." And then he left. He walked down the street as if the world had been ripped from under him. I didn't know where he was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there right now. Every corner of that house had become a battlefield. And he needed air. That night, he didn't sleep at home. He went to the apartment of an old friend, someone who asked no questions, only offered silence and hot coffee. He sat there on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker by as if the world were going on as normal. But his was in ruins. The betrayal hurt not just for the act, but for everything she symbolized. For all the effort he'd made, for every gesture of love that had become insignificant in the face of her decision. He felt discarded, exchanged for something he didn't even know what it was. And, above all, he felt foolish. Foolish for trusting blindly. For loving silently, thinking that would be enough. For believing that respect would be reciprocated. In the days that followed, the house felt like a museum of a past too recent to be history, but too distant to still be present. The spaces that had once belonged to her were empty. The smells, the objects, the echoes of laughter, everything had vanished at once. He began to live on autopilot. Work, home, silence. He avoided talking about it. When friends asked, he simply said they were having a break. But deep down, he already knew there was no more time to pass. Her decision was clear. And irreversible. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that this betrayal hid more than a simple desire for novelty. There was something behind it. A secret yet to be revealed. Something that, when it came to light, would change the entire perspective of events. Emily, for her part, continued with what she thought was freedom. She felt light, free, excited. The man she had fallen for was new, different, mysterious. The relationship had an air of adventure, of novelty, of everything she'd been missing lately. She convinced herself it was love. That she was simply following her heart. That Daniel, despite everything, was history. But her conscience, even silenced, begins to speak in the wee hours. And the emptiness she thought she had left behind began to reappear when she realized that not all promises truly hold weight. Daniel didn't look for her. He didn't text, he didn't ask for an explanation. He had learned, the hard way, that it's not always worth fighting for someone who chooses to leave. He began to dedicate himself to himself. Little by little, he rediscovered small pleasures, like taking walks in the late afternoon, cooking dishes he'd always wanted to try, reconnecting with old friends. Even though the pain was present, there was a dignity in his way of moving on. He didn't seek revenge, nor did he wish harm. But he also didn't accept crumbs anymore. Until one day, Emily reappeared. She appeared at the door as if no time had passed. Her eyes filled with something he knew all too well, regret. But now, it was too late. Daniel wasn't the same. And now she had something to say. Something that wasn't just forgiveness, or a plea for his return. It was something more. A truth she'd kept hidden, and that finally needed to be said. But what she had to reveal was still unknown to anyone. And when it did come to light, it wouldn't just be a detail from the past. It would be the trigger for something much bigger. Something that would change everything. Daniel was at the supermarket when the message arrived. 3 words on the screen lit a flame he thought he'd already extinguished: "I need to see you." For a second, he considered ignoring it, pretending he hadn't read it, continuing to push his cart through the aisles as if the notification didn't carry the weight of months of silence. But something in his chest tightened. It wasn't longing. It was unease. There was something in the tone of those words that felt different. Fragile. Scared. It wasn't an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. It was something deeper. Something he couldn't name, but which he had to face. He took a deep breath, put down the half-empty basket, and left without buying anything. They met in the park where they used to walk in the late afternoons. The same place where, 2 years ago, she had told him she loved him for the first time. Now, the cold wind cutting through the trees seemed to announce that nothing would ever be the same again. Emily sat on her usual bench, hugging herself, her eyes red as if she hadn't slept in days. When she saw him, she stood up slowly, as if her guilt weighed heavily on her. Daniel stopped a few steps away. There was no hurt on his face, nor any sweetness. He was a man at peace, but ready to listen, and perhaps, this time, also ready to leave for good. She tried to smile, but failed. The silence stretched on until she finally began to speak. She said she knew she had no right to ask for anything. That she didn't expect forgiveness, or retribution, or empathy. That she simply needed to tell the truth because she could no longer bear it alone. Daniel listened attentively, but without interrupting. Each word fell like drops on an already calm lake, breaking the surface but never sinking. She explained that the man she was involved with wasn't just a stranger who happened into her life. She said she hadn't met him at an event, as she had said. She said he sought her out directly. That he knew exactly who she was. And that, all along, he had a single goal: to use her to get to Daniel. Daniel frowned, not understanding. She continued. She said that months before the breakup, this man had approached her at an art exhibition. He was charming, engaging, and said all the right things. He seemed interested in her, but with a care that made her feel special. Emily, still confused by everything she was feeling at the time, allowed him to get close. She thought it was luck, destiny, something new and exciting emerging amidst the monotony of her routine. But the truth was much more bitter. The truth is, this man already knew Daniel. Not personally. But he knew his name, his face, his past. He was the ex-husband of the woman Daniel had been involved with years ago, before meeting Emily. An old, almost forgotten story, a brief relationship that didn't end badly, but that apparently left its mark on the other side. Emily said she only discovered all of this weeks after dinner. When the man, now distant and gone, posted an old photo online, a broken picture frame, with a picture of his ex-wife next to Daniel. The caption was straightforward, "The cycle closes." It was then that she began to connect the dots. The questions he asked, the subtle comments about Daniel's life, the almost obsessive interest in details of his past. The man had planned it all. He approached her not out of attraction, but out of revenge. He didn't want to build anything, only to destroy. And he succeeded. Daniel took a step back. His stomach churned. The name of the woman from his past came rushing back to him. A long ago, fleeting relationship that ended because she was still emotionally involved with her ex. He never imagined that, years later, it would still have consequences. And worse, he never imagined someone would be capable of planning something so cruel. Emily continued, saying she didn't want to believe it at first. That she thought it was a coincidence, a delusion. But when she tried to contact the man again, she received only a message in response, "Now you understand what it's like to be discarded." And nothing more. He disappeared. Daniel was silent for what seemed like an eternity. The wind blew stronger, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to stop. He turned, walked a few steps, ran his hand through his hair, and took a deep breath before saying anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but broken. He said that none of it changed what she had done. That, regardless of the other man's motivations, she had chosen to go. That she had betrayed him not because of pressure, but because she had wanted to. That she had given in because she wanted to, not because she had been deceived. That she had not been a victim, she had been an accomplice. Emily cried. She said she knew it. That she wasn't there to apologize or justify herself. But that she needed to tell him everything because carrying that truth alone was destroying her. She said she lost everything because of an impulsive choice, and that worse than Daniel's absence was knowing he now saw her as less than she once was. She tried to touch him. He recoiled. He said he'd already forgiven, but that didn't mean forgetting. And that, above all, he wasn't the same anymore. And neither was she. Her final words were almost whispered. She said she would understand if he never wanted to see her again. But if he ever looked back and thought of her, it wouldn't be with anger. He should just remember that she loved, even if badly, even if wrongly, even if too late. Daniel simply replied that he would remember. Not her, but himself. The man he was, what he felt, what he learned. And that, because of that, he was at peace. He turned and walked away. Without drama, without looking back. As he walked, I felt my heartbeat quicken. The truth had come to light. Betrayal now had a name, a face, and an intention. But it no longer mattered. The pain had served its purpose. And now, finally, he was ready to start over. And on the other side, on a cold park bench, a woman wept for what she had lost. Not just her love. But the version of herself that existed when she was still worthy of him. Daniel didn't return home immediately after that conversation. His steps took him through streets that were nothing more than shadows in his memory. He entered a small, old cafe, where the smell of fresh bread seemed to compete with the bitter aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He sat at the table in the back, ordered a strong espresso, and stared at his own reflection in the window, where the city moved indifferently, while inside him, everything had been reorganized. It wasn't sadness, nor was it anger. It was a kind of calm emptiness, as if the storm had passed, leaving only silence in its wake. The kind of silence that disturbs because you know that, after it, life either begins again, or collapses. That afternoon, he knew he faced that choice. And for the first time in a long time, he decided to start over. Across town, Emily arrived home as if entering unfamiliar territory. The space was the same, but everything felt out of place. The walls were tighter, objects seemed to watch her judgmentally, and even the bathroom mirror showed her a face she no longer recognized. Every corner held a memory that now hurt. The lamp Daniel had fixed when she accidentally broke it. The balcony plants he watered every morning when she forgot. The couch where they shared silent movies and oversalted popcorn. Everything was still there. Except him. She sat on the living room floor, crossed her arms over her knees, and let the tears fall uncontrollably. She wasn't crying for his absence, but for everything she'd buried with her choices. She was crying for the woman she'd been when she'd had someone by her side who loved her even on the days she didn't know how to love herself. 2 days passed without contact. Emily didn't text or call. She respected the space he'd imposed with the silence of their goodbye. Daniel, for his part, dove into life with an intensity even he'd never known. He returned to the gym, reconnected with old friends, resumed personal projects abandoned for lack of time, and allowed himself to explore a world where Emily was no longer the center. He wasn't seeking distraction, but reconstruction. He was relearning how to be whole, not just one half of a couple. And it was in this process that he met Olivia. A woman with a gentle presence, yet firm in her speech. With a sincere gaze and a laugh that seemed to embrace the room. They met by chance at a photography course he'd decided to take on impulse. They exchanged glances, words, smiles, and gradually, they built a connection without rushing. There was no urgency. There were no comparisons. Just two adults allowing themselves to exist in front of each other without the pain of the past as baggage, but only as scars. With Olivia, Daniel didn't need to explain what he'd experienced. She didn't ask for justifications, she simply offered to listen. She didn't invade, she simply made herself present. And so, day after day, he found a new version of himself, lighter, more mature, more attentive. There was no trace of desperation to be accepted. There was exchange. It was different from anything he'd experienced before. Not better, not worse, just different. And that, in itself, was liberating. Olivia didn't fill the space left by Emily. She created a new space. One he never imagined would exist. Emily, meanwhile, faced reality with a brutality that left her breathless. She began to realize how much Daniel had been present in every detail of her life. Not as a perfect man, but as someone who chose to love even on the days when she found it difficult to love. She realized, too late, that love isn't about novelty, nor about constant excitement. It's about security, about having somewhere to return to at the end of the day. She tried to keep busy, tried to go out, meet new people, but everything seemed too pale compared to the depth of what she once had. And the cruelest thing was knowing that she had destroyed everything with her own hands, believing she was only searching for herself. It was on a cloudy afternoon that their paths crossed again. Daniel was leaving a bookstore with Olivia when Emily spotted them in the distance. She stopped across the street, amid hurried footsteps and impatient honking, and watched them for a few seconds. She saw how she laughed at something he said. How he touched Olivia's arm naturally. How they both seemed to be exactly where they wanted to be. And there, amid the chaos of the city, Emily understood everything. She no longer needed a conversation, a request, an explanation. Her past had moved on. And his present no longer included her. Days later, the unexpected happened. Emily received a letter. Handwritten, in the handwriting she knew so well. Daniel had left it at her building, with the concierge. He said he didn't want to start a new conversation, he just needed to put in writing what he'd been carrying for too long. He said he forgave her, not because what she did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger would mean remaining trapped in something that no longer defined him. He said he wished she could find the peace she so desperately sought. He hoped that one day she could look back on everything they'd shared without pain, but with respect. And now, he had found what he'd always wanted, someone who wouldn't need convincing to stay. Emily read the letter dozens of times. Each sentence was like a mirror, revealing not only his generosity but also the immaturity of her choices. She wept silently, not because she wanted to return, but because she finally understood how much she had lost. And this understanding was what made her decide to walk away for good. He put the letter in a box, along with the few memories that remained. It was time to move on, not because she still hoped for something, but because she needed to find new meaning for herself. Daniel moved on with his life with ease. With Olivia, he discovered the pleasure of starting over slowly, of building something real without having to carry old burdens. He learned that pain transformed him, but didn't define him. And that love, ultimately, is less about intensity and more about constancy. It's about being there, day after day, even when the world outside seems to be falling apart. Olivia didn't ask for promises, but she offered her presence. And he, for the first time, felt exactly where he was supposed to be. Years later, on a random afternoon, Daniel crossed paths with Emily again. It was brief. A coffee, a street corner, a glance. She smiled sweetly and a little sadly. He smiled back with respect. There was no hurt, no desire. Just a chapter closed. And, perhaps, a silent understanding between them. Some stories don't end with a full stop, but with ellipses that time, little by little, erases. Emily moved on with her absence. Daniel, with his freedom. Both, with the knowledge that love, when poorly cared for, doesn't die, it just changes hands. Their brief encounter in that coffee shop, years after their breakup, was like a distant echo of a life that, though real, no longer belonged to them. There was no conversation, no attempts at redemption, just a look that carried everything that had been and everything that would never be again. Emily continued walking, her shoulders hunched by the weight of what time had not healed, and Daniel remained where he was for a few seconds, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the story that had shaped them, even if it had later torn them in opposite directions. In that moment, it became clear that it was no longer about forgiveness or resentment, but the inevitable understanding that certain wounds become scars that no longer hurt, but also never disappear. Daniel returned home with a bag of bread and flowers that Olivia liked to place on the table on weekends. Life with her was simple, but it held a quiet depth, built not on extravagant promises, but on daily, genuine presence. Still, that day, something inside him stirred. It wasn't longing. It was an involuntary reflection. The image of Emily walking alone on the sidewalk, her shy nod, her almost embarrassed smile, all of this made him realize that the cycle he thought had already ended might still have one last turn to take. Olivia was waiting for him at home, her hair tied back haphazardly, a book in her hand, and her bare feet on the sofa. He came in, handed her the bread, kissed her forehead, and sat beside her. He said nothing about the encounter. Not to hide anything, but because he knew there was nothing more to say. Some pains are yours alone. Emily, for her part, walked through the streets with the short steps of someone unsure of where she was going. After the reunion, night fell, and she entered her small, quiet apartment. She sat at the kitchen table and ran her fingers over the envelope she still kept with Daniel's letter. She read it again, as if that gesture could change something, but everything remained the same. The understanding that matured over time was bitter and cruel. The mistake wasn't just betraying her, it was underestimating the love she received. A love that didn't scream, didn't beg, but gave itself every day in small gestures. She imagined that freedom would bring new colors, but discovered that freedom without purpose only exposes the emptiness even more. And now, as much as she had grown, matured, and changed, there was no one there to witness this change. Daniel, despite the stability he had built with Olivia, also felt the inner layers of his history still settling. Emily's presence no longer invaded his days, but appeared in brief flashes of memory. It was no longer a pain, but a lesson learned, a fixed point in his timeline. The dilemma now was different. It was knowing to what extent the scar he carries shapes or limits him. Olivia noticed when he was pensive, but respected his silence. She didn't want to compete with ghosts. She simply wanted to be part of a real present. And Daniel, even though he still struggled with some memories, felt whole enough not to contaminate his current love with the pain of the past. What Emily destroyed, he rebuilt, with patience, with truth, and with a new awareness of what he deserved and should never accept again. Life continued with its unremarkable routine. Olivia got a promotion at work and suggested a trip to celebrate. Daniel agreed. They went to a peaceful place, surrounded by mountains, where time seemed to slow down and the sky opened up like an invitation to silence. During the trip, sitting beside a fireplace, she asked him if he believed love could have many forms, or if there was only one right person. He took a while to answer. He thought of Emily, not as a lost possibility, but as a finished story. He said he believed true love wasn't necessarily the first, but the one that arrives when you no longer need saving. Olivia smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. They didn't need to say anything else. Meanwhile, Emily dedicated her days to volunteering at an emotional support center. There, she found a way to make sense of her own pain. Helping others in crisis navigate their conflicts made her feel that, despite her mistakes, there was still something good she could offer the world. In one of the support sessions, she heard a woman talk about a worn-out relationship, about her desire to seek newness outside the home, about the fear of losing what she already has for something that might not even exist. Emily listened in silence and, for the first time, felt she could answer honestly. He said that understanding someone's value after they're gone is a pain not worth the risk. He said the glow of novelty fades, but the emptiness left when you lose a true love can last a lifetime. He said that sometimes we cheat not out of malice, but out of immaturity. And that the price is too high. The woman cried. Emily did too. Daniel and Olivia returned from their trip with more concrete plans. They considered moving in together, maybe even moving to another city. Their relationship was built on dialogue and respect. There was no rush. There was presence. During a dinner with friends, Olivia commented that Daniel was the most honest man she'd ever met. He smiled shyly, but deep down, he felt the recognition heal every part of him that had ever been questioned. Having someone who truly saw him, who valued him without him having to constantly prove himself, was everything he'd ever wanted. And now, finally, he had it. Emily, alone at home, looked at old photos and, instead of crying, just closed her eyes for a few seconds. She had learned to live with what she lost. She had understood that not all love returns, and that not all mistakes can be fixed. But that didn't stop her from growing from it. Time taught her to be honest, first with others, then with herself. She wasn't seeking redemption. She just wanted to keep living so that, one day, she could be proud of who she had become. Regret was no longer a prison, but a reminder of what she had done, what she had lost, and what she would never do again. The downward spiral of their lives was made of silences that healed, encounters that no longer hurt, and choices that, however difficult, now made sense. Daniel never saw Emily again after that last chance encounter. Olivia never needed to know the details of their past history because she trusted the present. And Emily, on her solitary journey of rebuilding, found peace not by forgetting, but by accepting. Because sometimes, losing someone who loved you is the starting point for learning, through pain, to become worthy of love again. And time, relentless, followed its course, leaving behind only the essential, the lessons. Spring arrived with a gentleness that contrasted with the emotional winters each of them had endured. Enough time had passed to transform pain into memory and memories into silent lessons. Daniel now walked lightly, not because he had forgotten, but because he had finally learned not to carry what was no longer his. The mornings in the house he shared with Olivia became his new refuge, the smell of coffee mingling with the sound of the old radio, his bare feet crossing the hardwood floor, and the sunlight streaming through the curtains with a gentleness that soothed his chest. It was there, in that almost poetic simplicity, that he understood what peace meant. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the absence of the expectation that someone would come and save him from it. He had already saved himself. One Sunday afternoon, sitting in the backyard garden they were learning to garden together, Olivia told her about an invitation to a new project in another state. It wasn't urgent, nor definitive, but it was an opportunity. She spoke with restrained enthusiasm, carefully measuring her words, as if she didn't want to scare anyone. Daniel listened attentively. He knew there was a chance to start over in an even more concrete way, away from the places where everything happened. But he also knew that escaping a scenario isn't the same as being ready to leave. When she finished speaking, he smiled, took her hand, and said that this time, he didn't have to stay any longer. Because he was no longer stuck in the past, he was, in fact, ready to move on. Not as an escape, but as a choice. Meanwhile, Emily began to redirect her life away from the memories that tormented her. She began teaching short self-discovery workshops, sharing with other women experiences about identity, choices, and the twisted paths we often take when we don't quite know who we are. She didn't use names or directly cite her own story, but her words carried such a transparent truth that it was impossible not to feel it. In one of these sessions, a young woman raised her hand and asked if it was possible to be forgiven for destroying something that was once pure. Emily took a while to answer. She took a deep breath, met the girl's uncertain gaze, and said that forgiveness begins when we accept that we can't go back, but we can move forward without repeating what brought us down. She said no, the past can't be erased, but it can be transformed into something that serves as a bridge to another version of ourselves. She said this with a lump in her throat that only she knew. Late one Friday night, Emily received an unexpected call. It was Daniel's mother. They hadn't been in touch for years, but the voice on the other end was steady and sweet, as always. He said he had something to give her. It wasn't urgent, nor was it obligatory. Just a gesture. He arranged to meet her the next day at a small cafe far from the city center. Emily arrived punctually, her eyes full of questions and her heart racing. The woman greeted her with a calm smile and an envelope in her hands. She said she'd found a photograph among her son's books that, for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to throw away, an old image, taken on a random weekend, of Daniel and Emily laughing, hugging, in a place they no longer knew where. He said he thought it only right to return it to the person who was part of the scene. Emily held the photo carefully, as if it were made of glass. She thanked him, but didn't know what to say. The woman smiled again, and before leaving, she simply said that sometimes the people we lose are actually reflections of the versions of ourselves we no longer are. And that, therefore, some losses are necessary. Emily stood there for long minutes, staring at the photo and trying to recognize the woman she once was. That same night, Daniel felt a strange urge. He was rummaging through old boxes looking for a book when he found a folded note Emily had written on their second anniversary. It wasn't a long letter, just a few sentences about love, care, and the future. He read it and felt no pain, no longing. He simply realized how everything said at the height of a feeling can, over time, become nothing more than the noise of the past. He kept the note but didn't return it to the box. He left it on the table, staring at it as a reminder that even the most sincere loves can become insufficient if not nourished by daily choice. Olivia, seeing him there, asked what it was. He told her. Without fear. Without trepidation. He just told her. She listened, smiled, and said she admired his ability to look at what was without getting lost in what could have been. And that was why she trusted him so much. Because he didn't lie about the past. But he also no longer lived in it. Months later, Daniel and Olivia decided to take on the project in another state. They packed their things calmly, donating what no longer made sense to carry. On the last night before the move, they walked through the neighborhood in silence, saying goodbye to the places that had shaped their final years. They stopped in front of the park where Daniel had last met Emily. He looked at the benches, the trail, the dark, calm sky. He simply said that there, one story had ended and another had begun. Olivia squeezed his hand and smiled, as if understanding that some memories don't need to be avoided, only accepted. On the day of the move, with everything ready, Daniel received a message from Emily. It was short. She said she'd heard about the move and wished him and Olivia a happy life, filled with everything they'd truly built. Daniel read it, thought for a few seconds, and replied. He said he was grateful, that he wished her the same, and that he hoped she would continue to be the strength for others that he once tried to be for her. There was no hurt. There was no rancor. Just closure. The road ahead was long, but now clear. Daniel no longer carried the wreckage of an unresolved past. Emily, though alone, finally didn't feel lost. And Olivia, with her patience and serene light, was living proof that love doesn't need to scream to be immense. Each of them, in their own way, was closer to being who they always should have been. And even though they didn't know what the future held, they were prepared. Because, deep down, what truly defines who we are is not the mistakes we make, but what we choose to do with their consequences. And sometimes, the greatest proof of love isn't in staying, but in allowing the other to go and build their own peace. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before them as the car crossed the line that marked the beginning of a new city. Olivia looked out the window, her eyes attentive to the details of this new place where they would now rebuild not just a life together, but a home based on conscious choices and clean pasts. Daniel drove in silence, not for lack of things to talk about, but out of reverence for what they were leaving behind. Each kilometer traveled was a symbolic farewell to old pains, to memories that no longer hurt, to the fragments that had been shed over time. He no longer thought about what would have been if everything had been different, no longer fantasized about what he had lost, nor idealized what had nearly destroyed his identity. In that moment, all he could think about was the peace he felt being with someone who didn't demand love from him, but who embraced him completely, scars included. Settling into a new neighborhood, surrounded by trees and the voices of neighbors who greeted each other naturally, the days began to take on a different texture. Olivia quickly found a new job, got involved in local projects, and met people who made her feel part of this new cycle. Daniel set up a small photography studio, something that for years had been a dream forgotten in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. With her support, he discovered he was more creative than he imagined, more sensitive than he'd previously allowed. Each portrait he took carried, without him realizing it, the mark of someone who had felt the pain of loss, but also the power of rebuilding. It wasn't long before they became a reference in the community, not for showmanship, but for the serenity they exuded together. There was a mature harmony between them, built on honest dialogue and glances that sought not validation, but only reciprocity. On the other side, in a different time, Emily lived her process with silent dignity. She chose to remain in the city where it all happened, not out of attachment, but because she believed that fleeing was no longer necessary. She was finally willing to face her own reflections without looking away. She began giving talks to young people in community centers, using her story as an example of how thoughtless choices can have irreversible consequences. She didn't present herself as a victim, much less as a martyr. She spoke with humility, with a sincerity that touched deeply. People listened, cried, and thanked her. She had become someone useful, even if through circuitous paths. Some nights were still lonely, and there were times when the silence of the house swallowed her up in inescapable memories, but she had learned to survive this without losing herself again. She no longer sought to rescue what she had lost, but rather to honor the pain that transformed her. It was during a photography exhibition organized by Daniel that the two saw each other for the last time. Emily hadn't known he would be there, nor had he expected to see her. But when their eyes met in the middle of the room, amidst camera flashes and mingled voices, there was a moment of silent recognition. Emily approached with a calm, unpretentious smile and complimented his work. Daniel thanked her, saying it was good to see her well. She replied that she was at peace and that she wanted him to know it. He responded sincerely, saying he saw that in her. Olivia joined him shortly after, with the lightness of someone unshaken by the past, and greeted Emily cordially. There was no awkwardness. There was no room for resentment, only respect. Emily said goodbye shortly afterward, crossing the room with a clear conscience. As she left, she didn't cry. For once, it didn't hurt. It was just life moving on, finally moving forward. Daniel and Olivia returned home that night feeling like everything was finally right. His story with Emily was no longer an open wound, nor an unresolved chapter. It was a closed chapter, a bridge to something bigger. With Olivia, he understood that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but someone willing to grow together, to make mistakes and get things right honestly, to choose the same person every day without needing guarantees. And that was all he needed to move on without looking back. Emily continued her projects, expanded her speaking engagements, and began writing a book about choices and rebuilding. She received messages from people who identified with her story, who said they had been saved by her words, and this strengthened her. One day, walking through a street fair, she saw a young woman crying quietly while holding a small notebook. She approached and asked if everything was okay. The young woman recognized her, hugged her tightly, and said she had given up on destroying her family because she had read a text she had written. Emily smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, and in that moment, she understood that perhaps her greatest purpose was precisely this, to prevent others from making the same mistakes. And so she continued, transforming regret into service, pain into healing, guilt into compassion. Time, as it always does, took its course. Daniel and Olivia adopted a dog, renovated their backyard, and gradually created new traditions. Birthdays were no longer difficult dates, Sundays became their favorite days, and silences, once burdensome, were now comfortable. Between shared books, late-night conversations, and unexpected trips, they built a love born not of promises, but of resilience. A love that didn't need to overpower anyone, because it wasn't born to compete, but to endure. He learned to love again without fear. She learned to welcome someone with a past without feeling threatened. And together, they learned that nothing is stronger than the truth spoken gently. Emily, in turn, had her name mentioned in an article about women who transformed their stories into social impact. She read it with eyes filled, not with vanity, but with gratitude. Not for the recognition, but for having survived the version of herself that nearly destroyed everything. The photograph Daniel's mother had returned was now framed in her living room, not as a memento of a lost love, but as a reminder that choices shape destinies. Sometimes with pain. Sometimes with beauty. And almost always with regret. Each of them moved on with their lives. Not with the perfection of romantic movies, but with the maturity that only true pain can teach. Love, when mistreated, fades. And when it does, it doesn't return as before. What's lost is lost. But what's learned is transformed. Now tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Do you believe it's possible to forgive someone who has cheated? Or that certain choices make it impossible to get back at them? We want to hear your thoughts. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more intense narratives like this. Every week, stories that show life as it is, with mistakes, pain, new beginnings, and also hope. And before we conclude, here's our reflection: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It breaks promises, destroys the foundation on which trust was built, and leaves scars that can't always be erased. There's no excuse that justifies the conscious choice to hurt someone who once gave you their heart. That's why this channel doesn't support, romanticize, and will never defend any form of betrayal. Until the next story. And may you always choose with your heart, but also with responsibility.